Hey everyone, I'm Cody and welcome to part 7 of building a full stack web application using Vue.js and Express.js. So if you remember on the other one, or part 6, we finished doing the bookmark logic so we can unset and set a bookmark. Now what we want to do is when we go to the browse page, if the user is logged in, we want to show a list of all the bookmarks that the user has inside some type of like table or whatnot. So the first thing we're going to try to do is if you go to the Vuetify docs. So whenever this thing loads, if I go down to components and I go down to, I think there's one called data tables, this is what I kind of want to display the bookmarks in. So if you see here, we could just do a nice simple table. And they give us some example code of how to do that. So basically you just do v data table, pass it some headers, some items, and then you pass it something to the slot to kind of tell it how to display the rows. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So going back to our UI, we need to go to our songs view component. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up the songs index. And then on this song index section, it would make sense if we just go ahead and add another flex area. So I'll just have the bookmarks be to the left. So let's say v flex, and then close that out. And then here, let's just assume that we have something called song bookmarks. Maybe keep it consistent with songs. So songs hyphen bookmarks. So of course that would assume that we actually have a view called songs bookmarks. So I'll say songs bookmarks and make that. Go ahead and scaffold that out so we have a blank thing to start with. And of course here we need to say songs bookmarks and include that down as a component. So this songs bookmark component is basically going to do a request to the backend and get all the bookmarks that the user has. And then it also needs like the songs that are kind of associated with that bookmark. So before we get started with that, let's just go ahead and kind of work out what the view is going to be. So again, I could probably do this in a panel. So I'll do a panel and I'll say title is bookmarks. Go ahead and save this and make sure that this is loading up. So let's see, what did I miss? So going back to our, I don't know why I have that one loaded up. Going back to our songs index, we have a vflex. I forgot to give it an actual like amount. So now it should show up on the left over here unless I have some type of console log. Oh, I forgot to put the K. I did bookmarks instead of bookmarks. So a little typo there, but okay, so now the panel's showing up. It's not necessarily aligned to the left, so let's kind of figure out why that's the case. And that's because I'm using a column here. So instead, let's just do a vflex row. Cool, so that's working. And then here, I think we should be able to do a class of margin left of 2. All right. So again, the plan is to have all the bookmarks on the left, and we have that left panel called bookmarks. And inside that songs bookmarks component, what we want to do is first, following the Vuetify docs, we can say v data table and define a v data table. And then inside the v data table, you can pass it a couple of attributes. So I can say headers is equal to headers pagination.sync is equal to pagination, and then items is equal to bookmarks. So then of course, assuming that you have those defined, so I'll say data is a function which returns headers, and then it returns pagination, and then it also returns bookmarks. which is just going to be an array of, let's just say, 2 objects at this point. I'm just going to go ahead and just hard code those. And headers, again, is an array of what you want the text to be for your row or for your column, and then the name of the key that you want it to reference from your bookmarks data. So in this case, I'm saying value is title, so that would assume that we have a title down here. And then we'll make another one here and just say text will be artist, and value is going to also be artist. So which means we could just go ahead and make one called artist here and put testing. And then I'm going to go ahead and just copy this to have 2 example data rows that we can use. And then for pagination, pagination is just an object, which a couple of options you can have. So I'll say sort by and then date. And then I'm going to say sort by descending true. So that means it's going to sort all the bookmarks by the last time I've bookmarked them in a descending order. So assuming I did not forget anything, in fact, I think I did, the next step is you need to first define a slot or pass in the slot of what you want the table rows to look like. So if I say template slot is equal to items, so remember somewhere inside this V data table, they defined a slot called items, and we're kind of just passing in this template to them. And then we need to define scope is equal to props. So what we want to do here is go ahead and just define a TD, and I want to say the text is going to be on the right, and that class text XS right is built into Vuetify, in case you weren't aware of the docs. And I'll make 2 columns for now. So I'll do first column is going to have props.item.title, and then the second column is going to have props.item.artist. So I should be able to save this, and let's see if there's any issues. Okay. So I refresh the page, and look here, we have a data table with the title of our song and the artist. So at this point, if you notice that we kind of hard-coded those header, not the headers, but the bookmarks here. So what we want to do now is actually request from the backend the bookmarks for this user. So as I'm going to say async mounted, and I'm going to go ahead and just say if the user is logged in. So I think here I can actually say, like, let me go ahead and kind of modify or steal some code that we used in the other one. So remember, we use computed map state. So here I'm going to do the same thing. Make sure we bring in the Vuex map state so we can access it. Awesome. And then here we should just be able to say this dot is user logged in. So if the user is logged in, we need to go ahead and make a request to the backend for all the bookmarks that the user has. So here I'll say user ID, and I'm going to pass it very similar to what we did here, just like that. So this should hit the backend and just go ahead and return everything that's for this user ID. And down the road, we're going to be using JWT, so we don't even need to pass user ID because this is going to be an authorized endpoint. But for right now, let's see, we can also probably map the user to our state, and instead just say this dot user.id. And of course, don't forget to bring in the service that we're trying to use. So up here, I'm going to import it. Go ahead and save. Let's see. So it is actually making the response, but unfortunately it's returning null. So we need to make a little bit of changes to the backend. And I think that was kind of an issue that we had with this index method. An index method should probably return an array, and right now I'm doing find1. So let's go ahead and try to change that index method to, instead of doing find1, we're going to do find all. And then so if song ID is passed in, I think this will be set, otherwise it won't even try to search for it. So by making that change that to bookmarks and bookmarks, remember that this is going to break our bookmarks functionality earlier because I'm changing the backend, but we'll make a mental note to go back and fix that. But for right now, we should be able to hit that backend and get an empty array back. So here we get an empty array, and then notice that we don't have, I don't think we have all those errors in the console at this point. And I guess we do. Let's see. So let's see why that could potentially be throwing an error for us. It might be because, let's see, first of all, this could be an empty array now because we're fetching it from the backend. And this seems to be working fine with the map state user because we're making the request to users equal 1, or user ID is equal to 1. Alright, so this error says expected array, got an object, leads me to believe that we're passing something incorrect to items. And again, always make sure you read the errors. Don't just see an error and kind of ignore it. Sometimes I do that when I should just actually read what the error is. But of course, this one's because I'm not grabbing the data. And I think soon I'm just going to refactor this so that I don't have to do .data every time and just have the service do that for me. Because that's kind of like bit me in the butt multiple times now. But yeah, I think, let's see. Go ahead and just refresh that page and hopefully the error's gone now. And yep, that was the issue. And we're hitting the endpoint, we're getting back no bookmarks for that user. So I guess the first question is, should we be getting back bookmarks? And I'm pretty sure that we have been setting bookmarks, but I'm not too sure. So let me just go into one of these songs and verify. Okay, so this one is bookmarked. Or has user ID of 1 and song ID of 1. So let me go back to the backend and let's verify what rec.query is. Because this one should be working just fine, unless this is actually trying to search where this is equal to null or something. Let me refresh the page here. So it's just user ID is equal to 1. So instead of doing song ID, let's just see what happens if I were to comment this out and see if it does return information for us to make sure that this is the issue or not. Okay, so that was the issue. It did return the bookmark back to us. And it's not running or anything because we haven't actually added some extra functionality. So one thing I'll do now is we'll fix this in a second. I guess it's trying to search undefined here. So instead we should probably say like where is equal to user ID, and then just say if song ID where.song ID is equal to song ID. And then we're going to say where there so that it works for both instances. But the important part is we want to get back the song that's associated with the bookmark. So in Sequelize, something you can do is if you pass in another option called include, you can pass in an array of objects or models that you want to include that are associated to the bookmark. So I can say include model song, and up here I have song included, so it should work. And basically whenever this returns, it's going to be an array of all the bookmarks, and then nested inside it will be the song information. So here I'm just going to say map everything to bookmark.toJSON, and then I'm going to map it again. And this time I'm basically just going to make a new object with the bookmark ID. So bookmark ID, bookmark.id. So extend that with the bookmark.song, which was returned. And again, I probably have to include Lodash so that I can actually use that extend method. Okay, so let's test this one out. And if we were to go, I might want to indent this so we know this kind of attached to that. Might make more sense like that. So if I were to go here and just refresh the page, I should be getting back an array of, okay, so this is the bookmark with all the song information related to that bookmark. And now it's actually displaying here. So that was kind of one way to do it. I didn't necessarily have to do this whole mapping logic. So instead, if I wanted to just leave it as is, so I'll go ahead and save that just to kind of show you what gets returned. So in this instance, if I were to make that request, if you see here in the JSON returned, we have a nested song object. So we have the bookmark information, and then we have a song object or attribute, which has all the song information. And I kind of just want the bookmark ID in the song, which is kind of why I added that whole like mapping stuff. I mean, maybe we could just change the front end to use this data as needed. But instead, I think it makes more sense to have the API just return the song that was associated with it as a flat object. So again, that's why I kind of added this extra mapping logic to kind of convert it. All right, so again, that little side note that we added where our bookmarks are probably broken now, we need to go back to the front end and go to that song metadata stuff where we have all that bookmarking logic. So now instead, when we do that request to set as bookmark, I think this is actually going to be working just fine. But now instead it's going to return an array here. So if we were to, let's see, this should be an array, and it could be blank. So I'm just going to say const bookmarks is equal to that. And then if bookmarks.length, I'm going to say this.bookmark is equal to bookmarks of index 0. And that's just so that we can grab the actual bookmark. Because now this should be returning kind of a different object. And then when we do the post request, instead of this.bookmark.id, I think we need to do bookmark ID because that's what's being returned in the backend now. And a little bit of code cleanup that I should probably do is also in map state here. Since we're trying to grab all that information, we could just do this.user. Cool. So let's double check that we did not break that functionality. So again, the bookmarks are working fine. We go in here, we click unset as bookmark and set as bookmark. Okay, so we're having an issue again. Oh, okay, I know why. So actually now when we post, that's returning a bookmark back. So maybe it would make more sense to not, or to just overwrite, let's see, ID with bookmark ID. Because we already have song ID, so. So here ID is 1, bookmark ID is 11, and I think that's our issue. Instead, we need to have ID is equal to 11. So where am I in my bookmarks controller? Let's see. I think we just need to swap this this order. Just make a new object, extend it with bookmark.song, and then also extend it with the bookmark. Okay, so let's try bookmarking just a couple of different songs. So if I go here to this ABC one, set as bookmark, go back to browse, it shows up here. Go back to the Modest Mouse one, we can go ahead and bookmark that one. Go back to browse, that shows up. And then to test that we can unbookmark it, of course, we should go back to ABC, unset as bookmark, go back to browse, and that's also disappearing. All right, so I think at this point, the bookmark logic is completely done. I'm not sure if this is the best way to do it, but it works for now. I think we can kind of move on to implementing a recent view. So the last piece of functionality I'm going to do for this tutorial is adding another panel that shows all the recent songs that you viewed. So that's something nice I think could be an app, is as you're like viewing different songs, you kind of want to have a history list of what you viewed. So let's go ahead and just make a new panel here in the front end called recently viewed songs. Viewed songs.view. And then let me just make this a little bit larger. Inside this, we're going to do very similar logic that we did to the bookmarks table. So again, maybe it makes more sense to just copy this and paste it in here. Instead of bookmarks, we could say recently viewed songs. Change bookmarks to songs. And then I'm going to say, instead of a bookmark service, I'm going to say recent or song history service. Same thing, display an artist in the title, display or sort by the date. Let's see, bookmarks, we call that songs. And yes, this stuff should probably stay as it was before. But instead of when we mount, we need to, instead of hitting that bookmark service, we hit the song history service and grab all this history for a user ID. Save this, go to my services in the UI, and just go ahead and copy bookmark services and rename it to song history service. So inside inside here, we don't really need to delete. I don't think we have to delete history, But in here, we can make a index, which is just going to give us back all the history for a user ID or something. So I'm just going to put params. And for here, we can do a post request to history endpoint and pass it some history data. So let's go ahead and finish working on adding that to the front end. So if I go here, I can say recently viewed songs is another component that we need to bring in. And of course, we need to use that. So I'll say recently viewed songs here. Save that. That should work fine. So okay, we have a table now called recently viewed songs. And of course, no data is being displayed because we're making a request to, I think, history, and that doesn't exist on the backend. And before I go and implement that, let's just go ahead and add some margin top to that. So say class is equal to mt2. Okay. So again, backend endpoint does not exist. So we should probably go and create one. And not only that, the model doesn't exist. So we need to kind of keep track of the history, right? So we're going to need another table so we can insert another row every time a user were to go to a page. So to kind of make that make more sense, maybe in the front end, if I were to go to the view song page, so if I go to the index here, when the user were to go into view, we want to make a request to the backend to keep track of that song that they viewed. So whenever they load a page, such as song/1, we can just go ahead and make a request to that history service. So I'll say import recently, actually I forgot what it was called, song history service. So grab the song history service, and then here we can just go ahead and say song history service dot post, and then we want to post the song ID and of course the user ID that viewed it. So if you notice here, we're doing some very similar logic with the state. So I need to go here and just bring that stuff in. So make sure we bring in map state so that we can get the user, and then we can say this dot user dot ID, and then we can also say only do this. I guess we did need that one, right? Only make this request if the user is logged in. Because if the user isn't logged in, we're not even going to show that panel, and we're not going to have it send back that information. And then for song ID, again, we can just do song ID here. And actually, maybe it makes more sense to have route come from there as well. I know someone left a comment saying it's bad practice to access the state directly. I don't know if that means map state is bad practice, but I mean, if they have a method called map state, if it's bad practice, why even use it? But hey, this seems to make the code a little bit cleaner. So recap again, the moment the user were to hit this page, so if I refresh this page, it's going to make a request to that history service, a post request to be specific, so that we can keep track of the song that the user tried to view. So now we can actually really go to the back end this time. And the first thing we want to do is copy and paste bookmarks because history is going to be very similar. So I'm just going to say history, and then rename all this to history. And then of course history belongs to a user and it also belongs to a song. So if we save this, we should be okay. We can go to our seed. Go to our seed project, And we can copy bookmarks.json. And instead of bookmarks, we can name it, let's see, rename history. And of course, we'll just say that yes, the user has seen this one, and it has also seen song ID of 2. And then go in here, go ahead and just rename that to history, rename this to history. And of course, you'd have to run this only after both user and songs have been ran. So it's going to go ahead and just say history, copy and paste that. I don't know if histories is even can be plural, but I'm just going to do history with an S at the end, even though that's probably improper English or grammar or whatever. And this is also turning green. I'm not sure if history is a keyword in JavaScript. Hope it's not, but let's just go with it and see what happens. So we have that model created. We have the seed created. At this point, we should be able to run the seed to have the history stuff injected. Oops, let me spell that wrong. Histories. That naming convention is just annoying, but... Okay, so now that data should be there, that table should be created, and we should be able to access it. Sorry, this is just bothering me. I'm just going to do histories with an S. So if we were to make another controller, actually first I'll make a route. So inside here I'll say make a histories controller and do an app.get on histories. Go ahead and call it the index method on that. And then of course we want to have a post method so that we can kind of create that history record. Go ahead and save that, and then we don't actually have a histories controller, so I'm going to rename this copied bookmarks controller to histories controller. Instead of bookmark, just do history. All right, so again, we need an index method and we need a post method. We don't really need a delete method, so we'll just go ahead and blow that away. And let's start kind of refactoring this logic a little bit. So we probably don't need Lodash, so let's go ahead and get rid of that. To start off, the index method, the user is going to send in a song ID and a user ID. Again, we need to request where user ID is defined. And I don't think actually we need song ID. So I'm just going to say user ID, which means that we don't really need to do all this extra logic here. And we don't need to do an include. Actually, no, sorry, we do need to do include because we're trying to display the song information. So I'll take that back. We do need Lodash if you want to do this whole like mapping goodness. But for now, let's see, histories. Basically, we grab all the histories, we map them. And we extend them with the song that we got. So very similar to the other logic. And then we send that back. And then for post, we need to, again, yes, take song ID and take the user ID. We need to not worry about finding if one already exists because we're not, this isn't like bookmark logic. So I can kind of remove that code. And here we can just say history equals await history.create, and of course pass it the song ID and the user ID and send it back that object after it's created. And here's where we're trying to create the history object. Cool, so probably have a bug somewhere in here. This could probably be cleaned up maybe, but let's test this out. Just make sure that we did everything right. We have those endpoints, we have the model, we have the controller, and we have that seed data that can be used to run it. So if we were to go back to the front end, so let's go ahead and close out of all this and go back to the index. Let's see, go back to the recently viewed songs. If we were to refresh the page, so go here and refresh the page, it's saying that the GET request on history is not found. And that's because this whole naming convention, I probably should have named it something other than history, but like recents, I don't know. But anyway, let's just add an S to these just because to keep it consistent. In fact, I'm wondering how Sequelize creates this table. Insert into histories. Okay, so they add, Sequelize is adding IES at the end for us automatically, and that's probably, the correct way we should be doing it because that's proper English. So I apologize for that. I'm just going to do a really quick code cleanup here. Make sure that's all good. Go here, make sure that's set correctly. Okay, go back to routes. Okay, so now it's named correctly and it's not bothering me anymore. So let's see how this works out. So when the app first loads, it makes a request to the histories endpoint, which you see here, get request on that, user ID of 1. The response is an array of 2 objects back, so that's working as intended. And then it's not being displayed correctly here, so let's double check that we're setting that correctly. So if I go back to the front end and go to the recently viewed songs, song history service index, it's probably because we're naming this bookmarks and it is expected to be called songs. So again, I'll just call that histories to keep it consistent. Save that, see what happens in this page now. Oops, forgot to update that too. Cool, so you see here now we have recently viewed songs down here, which if I were to click something new, such as like ZZZ, you see it made a request to histories with the song ID and user ID, and if I go back to browse, that also shows up down here. And then one thing to notice is that I think it's not sorting in the correct order. And I think I just need to sort on the created at date. So let's go back to the UI and sort by created at and see if that fixes the order. Boom, it does. Cool, so same thing with the bookmarks. Song bookmarks, go back to the sort order, sort by created at, and then I'm going to go ahead and just bookmark ZZZ. Go back to browse, and again ZZZ shows up at the top. And then one thing to notice is that it's doing this twice. So it might make sense to like run a unique call on the history list or something. I'm not sure. So again, we can probably go back to the Histories controller and just do like invoke unique on it. So basically, Lodash has a unique method which will just make sure that whatever set you pass in, or whatever array or collection comes out, is just going to be a unique set. So no duplicate values. So let's see if that does what we're trying to do. And it doesn't. I wonder why. Oh, I know why, because there's two different histories. So I think we could actually do like unique by and make sure we're uniquing it by something else. Anyway, I don't want to get too caught up on just fixing that little bug or feature, I guess. So I think that's good for history list, and I'm going to try to wrap up this tutorial really quick here. So I'm going to implement the last part that I've been kind of holding off on, and that is going to be the final part of the security using JWT. But okay, so before we do that, let's just go ahead and just do that whole unique thing. Just kind of, again, something else that's kind of bothering me. So if I do unique by, which again is another method, I can pass it in a collection, and then lastly you pass it in some type of function to tell it what needs to be unique. So I'll say history and history.songid. So basically return us a unique collection where the key is going to be the song ID. So if I were to save this and refresh this, okay, so we're only getting back 3, even though we have like viewed ZZZ a couple of times now. Cool. So moving on to the very last part of this whole series, we want to bring in a framework or library called Passport, which is very useful for using like Facebook authentication or Twitter authentication, GitHub, whatever. And it also has a lot of like of the default authentications. So first of all, let's just go ahead and go to the server and do an npm install save on Passport. And then we're also going to want to bring in something called Passport JWT. So with those two libraries, we can actually start going in here, and we want to set up the passport logic when the app loads. So I'm just going to say require passport, which means that, remember I'm doing /, which means that there's probably a file at that location. So we're going to assume that there's a file called passport in the main app. And this isn't like necessarily how you have to build up your app, but this is just how I wanted to do it, because there's actually a module called Passport we're going to include. So it might be kind of confusing, but bear with me. So inside this Passport.js app, what we're going to do is include that Passport library, which is done installing. And we're also going to need to include the user model from the models. And there's a couple of things that you need with Passport. So the first thing is the strategy that you're going to be using. So I'm going to include a JWT strategy, which is basically going to be that other library that we brought in, like this. And then there's another strategy called extract JWT equals, let's see, passport JWT extract JWT. So this isn't actually a strategy. This is just kind of like a helper function. Okay, so we've included those two things, and now what we want to do is we can say passport.use. I'm just going to say module.exports null, just to be kind of explicit that this isn't really doing anything other than setting up this passport object. So on 7, we say passport.use. We need to pass it the strategy that we want Passport to use. And that strategy takes in a couple of options. So the first option is JWT from request. And we're telling it to use the extract JWT from auth header as bearer token. And what this means is basically if someone makes a request that has the bearer token and the authorization, it's going to go ahead and use that. And then secondly, we need to pass it some type of secret key. So I'm going to say config authentication.jwt secret. And I think I forgot to include config, so I'll just say const config is equal to require config. And make sure we have that secret defined, which we already do because we used it for creating the JWT token. So basically this strategy is going to decode and verify that the token that comes in on this header is valid. And during that whole logic, we can just go ahead and pass the strategy yet another callback where we can do some custom logic to verify and return messages based on if the payload is valid or not. So in here, I'm just going to say try and then catch error. If there's any type of error, we can just go ahead and say return done, new error, false. And I'll explain what exactly is going on here. Up here, we can say the first thing we need to do is when we get a request, we need to first check that the user exists in the database. So I'll say user equals await user.find1 where ID is equal to JWT payload.id. And JWT payload is going to be whatever we decide to encrypt or to sign. So if you remember in the authentication controller, we sign the user and user has a .id attribute. So when it comes in and if it's validated or verified, we can just go ahead and grab that ID and say if the user does not exist for whatever reason, we can just return a new error and false. And then otherwise, we could just return that user object. Let's see, why is this throwing? I think I'm just missing a close parentheses. Yep. So this may not make 100% sense right now. I'm going to come back and kind of walk you through this one more time. But basically, if you pass back in the strategy and the second parameter, a user, it's going to set it for you on rec.user for you. So basically, this is the only instance where rec.user will be set. The other ones are going to result in errors. But since we're going to do some custom logic, we're going to add a folder called policies. In fact, we already have a controller called policies. But I'm going to make a file called isAuthenticated.js. And inside here, I'm going to go ahead and just include passport. And this is going to export a function which calls the passport.authenticate JWT strategy. Keep pronouncing that wrong, JWT. Okay, so again, walking you through this, basically, we're going to be using this policy is authenticated and putting it in front of our routes. And this is going to call Passport Authenticate with the JWT strategy, which will make sure that it will call whatever this strategy is we created and put here. So again, this logic is going to try to find a user if it exists in the database. If it doesn't, return an error. If it does, return that user. And notice that we're doing error here and false, and then null and user. We can say error and user, which are just being passed to this function here. And of course, we can say if there was an error, we need to go ahead and just say res.status of 403 authentication error.send error message to be you do not have access to this resource or something like that. And then otherwise, a user is probably logged in. Not probably, they are logged in and their user exists in the database, and the token that they used is validated correctly against our secret that was defined in our config file here. So that means that everything should be good. And at that point, if I can go back to whatever file is in, we can just call next. So taking back what I said about Passport, we are going to pass in user here, and our custom callback authentication logic is going to set rec.user for us, because I didn't really like the way Passport's default error was being sent back. They weren't sending back a JSON object, they were sending back like HTML code. And if I want to purely REST like JSON API, I kind of had to write this custom logic. But anyway, going forward, how do we actually use this authentication endpoint? And hopefully this doesn't have any issues with it, but first step is we can go to routes, and then some of the things that we want to authenticate include, let's say, the bookmarks, right? So if someone's trying to access their bookmarks, so I can say is authenticated, and of course I need to bring that in up here, so I'll say const is authenticated is equal to require policies is authenticated. So we want to authenticate this GET request on the bookmarks to say, hey, the user has to be logged in. They have to have a JWT token that's sent in. It needs to be valid, and it needs to be connected to a proper user ID. So if you remember before in that bookmark controller, if I go to that controller here and go to index method, we were assuming that user ID was passed into the query string. So at this point, it makes more sense to instead set user ID equal to rec.user.id, because that's coming from the JWT token, which has been proven to be valid. So we don't want to accept it from the query string anymore. Instead, we just accept it from the user ID. And I think that should completely change and make this endpoint authenticated. So if I were to save this, and if I were to go back to, let's say, this, let's see what happens if we try to refresh this to bookmarks. Let's see, unknown authentication strategy, JWT. All right, so I was kind of like debugging this a little bit, and I actually forgot to do not user. So basically this could be set to false, which if you remember, I think we were setting it to false in a couple of these instances. So again, if there's an error or if this is not true or not defined, we need to send back an error. Otherwise, set rec.user is equal to user and then call next. So now if I were to refresh this page, we get back an error, 403 forbidden, because we're not passing in an authorization header. So at this point, we need to add an authorization header to the request headers, which if we were to go back to the client and then go back to that API function that I created, we can go over here and I think we can just do headers. Let's see. Get the tooltips out of the way. We can say headers, and then we can say the type or name of the header, so authorization. And then of course we can just say bearer. And then the token. Right, so, but the token, remember, is stored on the store in the state. So I'm going to import the store up here. So /store, at least I think that's, if I remember correctly. Yep. So I'm going to import the store, and then instead of store, or instead of token, I'm going to do store.state.token. So now whenever that token is set, it's just going to add it to the header here. And I think if I were to go back here, we see that now it's passing bearer and the whole token there, which means that now we get a response back with all of the, let's say, bookmarks related to that user. And just to show that we don't need the user ID in this parameter, let's just go back to the UI. So I think the backend is at least done for adding the extra authentication for JWT, but in the front end, if we go to song metadata, which is here, instead of sending user ID, we no longer need to send that because that's going to be extracted from the JWT token on the back end. So I'll go ahead and save this. And I think this as well. All right, so for set as bookmark and unset as bookmark, we no longer need to pass in user ID either. So let me just go ahead and go to the routes for that and say is authenticated for post and also is authenticated for, I think, delete. So then if I go to bookmarks controller for post, instead of user ID here, we can say const user ID is equal to rec.user.id. And then for delete, const.user_id is equal to rec.user.id. And then instead of doing find by ID, we only want to find, like this is a way to add some type of security into our controller. We have the user ID, so instead we could say find one, and then where we could do ID is equal to bookmark ID, and then also we can check where user ID is equal to user ID, if that makes sense. So basically this will only return a bookmark if the user is trying to access one that they already have access to. So I could say if not bookmark, I could again return res.status.403, send an error saying you do not have access to this bookmark. And otherwise you could just do an await and then destroy. Let me go back here and make sure that seems like it's all okay. So unset as bookmark works as intended. Set as bookmark is also working as intended. So those are working. And if I go back to browse, let's see, go to here, set as bookmark, make sure that still shows up. Cool. So bookmarks are still working. And now they're authenticated against the JWT token instead of the user passing in that user ID inside of the query string. In fact, I think I still am doing that here. So let me just go ahead and do some further cleanup. Try to find out where that's being passed in. Oh, that's being passed in on the index page. So if I were to go to here, songs bookmark, we do not need to pass in user ID here anymore. So go ahead and save that and go back and let's just refresh it so we have a fresh state. So notice here we're not passing a query string in anymore, but we are passing in the authorization bearer JWT token and we're getting a response back. And then we should do the same thing for the recently viewed songs. We should probably add some type of authentication over that. So I'm going to go over to the back end, to the routes. Same idea. I'm just going to say add is authenticated to this endpoint and to this endpoint, and then go into the Histories controller. And again, we could just grab user ID from rec.user.id because we know it should be defined only if this user was valid. I think we're okay there. And then same thing with this. Instead of grabbing it from the body, let's just grab it from that rec.userid and return the same stuff. So make sure the server restarted, refresh the page. Let's see, it looks like Histories is not returning anything now, so let's see why. So Histories, we are passing the token still, and we're also passing user ID in the query string, so let's just go ahead and get rid of that because it's just extra stuff that we don't need to pass. So user ID, get rid of that. Let's see. And then same thing with view. When we go to view a song, we don't need to be posting the user ID anymore. Just the song IDs should be sufficient enough. But okay, so Histories is returning a blank array, which is not expected. So let's go back to Histories controller and go to the index method. And let's just go ahead and print out what user ID is set to. So it's set to undefined for some reason. I wonder if rec.user is just not even defined either. Let me make sure I'm actually, let's see, is authenticated. Wow, that's kind of weird. So I'm printing out the user and it's actually having like data values. This is so strange. Let me print out toString. JSON, I mean. All right, so rec.user.id is equal to 1, but when I print out user ID, it is undefined, which is very strange because I'm not, oh, duh. Let me get rid of that. All right, that should fix it. Let me make sure I didn't do anything stupid with the other one. User ID, user ID. Yeah, so the main issue is I had this in curly braces. So that was my bad. All right, so refresh this page now and we get back the recently viewed song. So the Histories is now returning something. And if I were to try to view a new song, it's doing a post request and that seems like it's saving correctly too. And if I were to log out, we wanted bookmarks and recently viewed songs to disappear, but they did not. So again, we can go back to our UI, go to the songs page. Let me just go ahead and get rid of some of this stuff. And basically here in this left panel, we want to say vif, and then is user logged in. And then we could just go ahead and grab that Vuex map state logic. So pull that in, pull that computed thing in. So now if the user isn't logged in, those two should disappear. And I want this thing to become a full 12, what's it called? Like 12 columns, I guess. So if I were to, let's see. All right, so something else we can do here is if, for whatever reason, the user is logged in or isn't logged in, we can go ahead and just bind a dynamic class to this. So instead of saying XS6, what do we actually want to do? Let me indent this one. Is say put XS6 if the user is not logged in. Actually put a 12 if they're not logged in, and put a 6 if they are logged in. So that should make sense. That should expand to a 12 if the user isn't logged in, which you see here. And then the moment we log in over here, testing@gmail.com, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, save that. We now get 2 columns on the left, or we get a column on the left of width 6, and then a column on the right of width 6. Make sure this is all still working as expected. Alrighty, everyone. I think that kind of wraps up the remainder of everything I wanted to work on. I know I could probably continuously add on new features and functionality to this app, but the purpose of this series was just to give you a really good overview, or not a good overview, but a basic overview of how to use Vue, how you may want to use Express, an example way of how to build up your project, how to organize it, a couple of overviews about npm, SQLize, Passport, authentication, JWT, Vue, Vuetify, Vuex for storing your state, persisting your state to local storage. So I kind of just hit all the different things that you might have in a real world full stack application, but I didn't necessarily go super in depth onto all the different things we could have. So a couple of ending remarks. I kind of started out this video kind of typing verbatim from a pre-existing app that I worked on. But then as I went further on with the parts, I kind of just started doing ad lib. So that's why we kind of ran into more bugs, and you got to watch me do more debugging. So I guess one question I had was watching me struggle with debugging useful for you? Was it helpful to see me go in here and try to figure out, okay, why is this returning this status? Figuring out the console logs, or would it have just been better to just see the app created with very little bugs or debugging? So let me know about that. Also, let me know if you have any feedback or any suggestions of how I could have made my code better. There's different things in Vue that I probably, after this series, I'm actually going to read the whole entire Vue documentation. I'm going to read all the Vuex documentation, probably going to read all the Vuetify examples and documentation, because I didn't really do that before making this. So that's kind of my bad, but I didn't really have the time to do that. But yeah, definitely feel free to send me a tweet and give me feedback on how I could make this video, how I could have made this video better. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to mention. Yeah, I guess the last thing I mentioned is, again, this project is hosted on my GitHub repo, which is in the description below. And feel free, if you wanted to keep adding features onto this, I will review the code and I'll give you feedback on cool feature that you added or whatnot, and I'll merge it into the actual branch. So if you want to get practice doing a fork off of the repo and then submit a PR, I'm not going to be a really strict, I'll just read through it. If it seems okay, I'll just merge it in. Why not? And maybe I'll grab it and just play around with it. So again, totally feel free to try to add features onto this. I have no problem with you doing that. And also feel free to just grab this project and do whatever you want with it. It's MIT. So I Again, I really hope this tutorial was really useful for you all. I know there's a lot of places that I messed up on and I probably could have done better, but again, this is totally free tutorial and I didn't really have all the spare time in the world to make sure it was perfect. So I hope it was a good overview. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you will continue to learn how to program and build full stack applications by yourself and make your own progress. And feel free to ask me questions if you have any questions or suggestions. Again, my name is Cody Seibert, and feel free to follow me on Twitter, which is in the description below. And be sure to look out for more videos on freeCodeCamp in the future. And good luck and have fun on your latest programming endeavors. All right, have a good one.